Hi, I'm here today to give you a spoiler-free review of the first book in the Book of Dust trilogy by Phillip Pullman, aka La Belle Sauvage. So before I get into a review of the different aspects of this book, let me give you a brief synopsis. So the Book of Dust trilogy is set in the same timeline and the same world as Phillip Pullman's first trilogy, which is His Darkest Materials. So we're returning to that same world, but the events of this trilogy are happening before His Darkest Materials begins. So the main character from His Darkest Materials was Lyra Belacqua, and we've returned to a time when Lyra was just a baby. Instead, we're following the story of a young boy named Malcolm who becomes involved in Lyra's life. He is quite an intelligent and observant young boy, and as a result of that, he ends up involved in these particular events that take place because of the fact that the government in England at the time is incredibly corrupt. So there's all these different sectors of the government that are trying to outsmart each other and outmaneuver each other. It's very complicated, and obviously Malcolm doesn't understand all of it or even very much of it because he's only a child, but it becomes very obvious that Lyra is important in this kind of war that is happening between these different sectors of the government. And basically it comes to a point where Malcolm has to get involved and go on this journey in order to save both his own life and the life of Lyra when she is still a baby. So first up, let's talk about the setting in this book. Anyone who has read Phillip Pullman's books before will be familiar with the fact that it's this very odd mix of historical fiction and science fiction and fantasy. We're set in England, and in particular in London and surrounds, but this London is very familiar to us because it's basically the London of the industrial period in our own history, but it also has these fantasy and these sci-fi elements brought into it as well. There's all these technological advancements and all these magical things that happen in the world as well. A lot of this book is set around the Thames as well. Malcolm, the main character, lives basically a very short journey outside of London along the Thames River, and a lot of the story happens either in London or in the hometown where Malcolm is, or along that river in between where Malcolm lives and where London is. So the river is a very important part of the story as well, which is fairly obvious when you look at the front cover anyway. So obviously this is a style of book that I really enjoy, which is why I gave the setting for this story a 4-star rating. Now let's talk about the plot for this book that I'm looking at right now that I've blanked on the name of. So the plot was really interesting because the book actually happens in 2 parts, and the first part and the second part are very different in terms of narrative style and almost genre style as well. So the first part of the book is where all of this kind of government outmaneuvering of each other is happening, and basically everyone just trying to get as much information as they can so that they have the upper hand in this kind of, it's almost like a Cold War kind of, you know, it's kind of like in the back alleys of the war rather than like actually an open battle. Everything is kind of on the brink of chaos because all of these government sectors that are trying to outsmart each other are getting to the point where something is going to have to give. Everything's going to come to a head basically. And then the second half of the book is like after all of that comes to a head and Malcolm is basically forced to go on this journey in order to escape people who are now chasing after him and who are also chasing after Lyra. So the pacing of the narrative in the second half of the book is very different to the first half. Everything happens a lot more quickly. There are more actual events happening rather than just like this gaining of information, and everything's a lot more disjointed because of the sort of the speed and the nature of the journey that Malcolm takes. So each kind of chapter in the second half of the book is like a new obstacle or a new challenge for Malcolm to overcome while he's trying to escape for safety, and they don't necessarily need to be connected to each other or lead on from each other. So it's very disjointed, and it kind of reminded me a lot of something like the Odyssey, or even a little bit like Huckleberry Finn, because this narrative is being kept in place by the journey that's happening, but none of the events along that journey are necessarily influenced by each other. I did really enjoy both of those 2 halves, but there was a point in the middle where I found it difficult to keep reading because of the change in pace. I found it a little bit jarring. So because of that, I ended up only giving the plot in this particular story 3 stars. So now let's talk about characters and relationships, which is something that I'm really excited to talk about because they were some of my favorite parts of this particular book. One of my favorite things about Malcolm as a character is that he was an extremely realistic 11-year-old. So he was intelligent for his age and he was extremely observant, but he wasn't unrealistically so. So often he would make the right decision or come to the right conclusion about something that's happening around him, but his reasoning and his logic in order to get there was very naive and childlike. And that's one of my favorite things about Phillip Pullman Pullman in general is that he's always written these kind of childhood protagonists who were very realistically childlike. So Malcolm is another character like that, and it was really refreshing to read about this character who's involved in all of this complicated stuff that's going on around him, but he was still just a child, and he was just still doing the best that he could as a child to get through that. I found that really refreshing to read because I don't think you come across that very often, particularly in fantasy novels, and because of that I gave it a 5-star rating. So there are all the 3 sections of the book that I would like to talk about. I would talk about themes, but I didn't really come across any themes that I felt needed to be talked about that much in this particular book. So all that remains is for me to say that I gave this book a 4-star rating overall, and if you've read his Darkest Materials but you haven't read this yet, I can guarantee that it won't be a disappointment if you ever do get around to picking it up, because it very much does justice to the original series, and that world, that environment, that setting is still the same and it's still just as magical as it is in the first trilogy as well. Strongly recommended. It was a really lovely read, very surreal, very magical, lots of different genres and settings and narrative styles all mixed into making this book, and I can't wait to read the next one when it is released. So that is it for my review. This is my second attempt at filming this review because the first time I filmed it all as a time lapse instead of an actual review. I will see you in some other video very shortly, I am sure, and until then, as always, stay classic.
Sit there and count your fingers.